see. Good afternoon. I'm Albert Carnesell, Provost of Harvard University and Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. It's my privilege to welcome you to this special event. We're co-sponsored this afternoon by the School of Government, the Institute of Politics, the Harvard Institute for International Development, and Harvard Law School's East Asian Legal Studies program. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to take a moment to announce the creation of a new fellowship endowment at the Kennedy School, the Mini Azminya Fellowship. It's especially appropriate that this fellowship be announced today because it will benefit students from the Philippines to study at the Kennedy School. It is, in fact, the first permanent endowment established at the Kennedy School to bring students from a Southeast Asian country to study public policy here. The Mini Azminya Fellowship is being established by a Kennedy School alumna, Maria Victoria de la Rama Azminya, who's a graduate of this school in 1978. I invite Ms. Azminya, who is here with members of her family. This fellowship carries on a long tradition of public service by the Sirio Azminya Jr. family to the Republic of the Philippines and the island of Cebu. Please join me in thanking Minnie once again for this wonderful announcement. Thank you. And now let me introduce our speaker. For any student of government, the dramatic and often inspiring, often frustrating recent history of the Philippines is a compelling case study of a democracy trying to stand. Our guest this evening has lived his life in the context of that history, and now he shapes it. President Fidel Ramos was born to a political family. His father was a lawyer, a crusading journalist, a legislator, and the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. His mother was a teacher and a suffragette. President Ramos is a 1950 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Seeing the need of the Philippines to rebuild after the ruins of the Second World War, he went on to earn a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Illinois. He returned to the Philippines to resume his military career, serving in Korea as well as in Vietnam. He rose to the very top as the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. He's also known as the father of the Philippines Army Special Forces, an elite paratroop unit which was equally skilled in community development as it was in fighting insurgents. In 1986, he emerged as the military hero of the Philippine People Power Revolution. And in 1988, he directed the Philippine Department of National Defense in the cabinet of Corazon Aquino, where he was a force for stability in military government relations. And in 1992, in the first multi-party election in Philippine history, he was elected as president. In that role, he successfully defends against a series of military takeover attempts, and he has begun the even more difficult task of uniting and empowering the people of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming His Excellency President Fidel Ramos.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carnesell, the Provost of Harvard University. Also greet Dr. Richard Hunt, the Marshal of Harvard University, faculty, staff, administration, students, alumni of Harvard University, including outsiders like myself who are here. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and delight to visit Harvard and to bask, however briefly, under its scholarly shade in this forum at the Kennedy School of Government. Through its various colleges and the Kennedy School especially, Harvard has cultivated an admirable relationship with countries and governments all over the world. And it's not surprising that many who have passed its portals have occupied or occupy leading positions in the public and private sectors in many countries. And in this, the Philippines is no exception. Today, there are some 400 Filipinos holding key positions in business, academia, and government who have undergone some years of schooling in this great university. This, I am told, is a lot of Harvard alumni for one country, especially for a developing country. It is said that when told back in 1986 that there were 7 Harvard alumni in President Aquino's cabinet, then Harvard President Derek Bock quipped, "Are you telling me good news or bad news?" Well, it's really for former President Cory Aquino, my partner in politics, to answer this query. For my part, I can report to you, Doctor, ladies and gentlemen, that I began office in 1992 with 6 Harvard alumni in my cabinet, and 3 more came in. One of them, who was in that first cabinet, after 1 week, had to make a choice to remain in the Ramos cabinet or to come to Harvard. Of course, he came to Harvard. But I made sure that he would come back to the cabinet after his 2 years here. I'm talking about our Secretary of Environment and Natural Resources, Victor Ramos. By the way, he comes from my own home province of Pangasinan, but we are not related because nepotism is prohibited in the Philippine government. May I point out those that are here today who are part of your alumni? Our Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Domingo Jun Siason, former ambassador to Japan and former Director General of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, or UNIDO, based in Vienna. Then we have our Secretary of the NEDA, National Economic Development Authority, which is really National Economic Planning, Dr. Celito Habito, PhD, Harvard University. Our Secretary of Trade and Industry, MBA, Harvard, Secretary Roy Navarro. And well, we have 2 of our distinguished congressmen who are your alumni, who are in my party, the Chairman of Economic Affairs of the lower house, Congressman Payumo, and the champion of human rights advocacy and indigenous people's causes, Congressman Abad, also from this school. And there are several more who didn't make the trip because somebody has to mind the kitchen back home. We have several undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, and heads of separate agencies, also from Harvard. I would like to mention also that part of our business delegation, who heads one of the biggest agribusiness, property development, and multinational in the Philippines, is the president of the Philippine Harvard Club in the person of Jaime Sobel, over here. And there are many more in the business group. Uh, I must mention also that Mrs. Ramos, I don't want her to be left out because I will suffer the consequences later on tonight. Is a graduate of the Boston area, Sargent College, Boston University. The so-called muscle factory, is it? Well, she specialized in physical education. That's why I'm a little careful. And those that have left the cabinet really were pirated by the private sector. You know the big difference between salaries in business and in government. And maybe this is one subject that this school should study so that government will have a better deal. Ladies and gentlemen, if after 3 years we have succeeded in putting the Philippines back on track towards growth and modernization, that is surely partly because of the contributions of our Philippine Harvard alumni. And so, yes, answering the question of former President Bok, Harvard alumni in my government is good news. The story of current Philippine resurgence is perhaps more than of routine interest to students of government for a number of reasons. First, we began self-government in 1946 when we obtained our independence from the United States, exactly on July 4th, 1946. The 5th anniversary is coming up, and we invite all of you to go there and join us in that celebration. We were supposed to be America's showcase of democracy in Asia. Yet, for the better part of the post-war era, we have been instead an illustration of democracy's failure to win economic progress. Today, after a 14-year interval of authoritarian rule and many more years of difficult transition, we are once more a full-functioning democracy. And for a change, we are making progress politically and economically. Second, in East Asia today, conventional wisdom holds that an authoritarian regime is the way to growth for developing countries because it is best equipped to mobilize the resources and compel the social discipline that make rapid growth possible. The same East Asian wisdom suggests that democratic government, in contrast, hampers economic growth, primarily because it is prejudiced toward borrowing and consumption and is too loose and unfocused. Yet, significantly, it is through full and people-empowered democratic government that the Philippines has made its economic turnaround and now is moving determinedly toward national modernization. And third, we in the Philippines have attracted some attention because in order to make this fresh start at modernization, we have literally had to reinvent our very idea of our own nationhood. We have turned on its head the ideology of narrow nationalism that had governed public policy making in the past and led the Philippines to adopt such policies as economic protectionism, economic nationalism, distrust of foreign investments, legislated wages, public subsidies, and price controls. Today, with these mistaken policies behind us, we define our course toward the future in a more liberalized way, with linkages to the world economy and the international community considered as fundamental. And so I will focus my remarks here today on what our experience in the Philippines has to say about the relationship between democratic government and economic progress, and the opportunities and challenges that arise from our development course. It bears saying, ladies and gentlemen, that we chose the path of democracy not in conscious repudiation of the course that our economically successful neighbors in Asia-Pacific had taken, but in recognition, rather, of who we are as a people. In a way, we Filipinos had no choice but to try and modernize along constitutional and democratic lines. History had shaped our political culture in such a way that authoritarianism would not work for us. Indeed, for 14 years, from 1972 to 1986, we tried to play the authoritarian card and dismally failed. Those who wonder about this failed experience with authoritarianism might consider this explanation. Authoritarianism in East Asia was typically built on strong, efficient, and relatively autonomous bureaucracies, coupled with weak political awareness on the part of its citizens. Our political tradition in the Philippines is exactly the opposite. From our colonial rulers, we inherited a weak civil service, but strong political awareness on the part of the people, even among the poorest and most isolated Filipino communities. It is said, partially in jest but also seriously, that the Philippine experience constituted of two things: 350 years in a Spanish convent and 50 years in Hollywood. And you can imagine what kind of combination that produced. It is so easy to belittle our representative system. We have one exactly like yours, with 3 branches of government under a presidential system and an independent judiciary. But ordinary Filipinos do put their faith in it. And except for the 14-year period of martial law, the peaceful transition from one presidential administration to another, which describes in one important way democratic government, was a regular happening in our country. To find our way back into this tradition, we have had to fight for our democracy and then ensure the perpetuation of democratic rule. This requires rebuilding the institutions and strengthening the culture of democracy, representative and accountable government, majority rule with minority rights, and the rule of law. The government of my predecessor, President Corazon Aquino, carried out the initial task with courage and determination, presiding over the drafting and enactment of a new constitution, and beginning the process of returning government to the people at the local level by strengthening the province, the township, and the village. And the success of this work is evident in the succession. Changes in the executive and legislative branches were accomplished since 1986 up to now through peaceful elections. Now, as we approach the 10th anniversary of our People Power Revolution of February 1986, the future of democratic rule, in my view, is secure in the Philippines. Mutinous military officers have abandoned the rebellion, and only last October 13th, 1 week ago, they entered into a general agreement for peace and development with our government negotiating panel. The communist insurgency has collapsed, and we are in the final stages of negotiating an honorable peace with Muslim separatists. That is why I say the Philippines is a functioning democracy, not a country still in transition, not a newly democratic country, but a country with sturdy and effective democratic institutions and a robust democratic culture that is shared by virtually all of the Filipino people. To embrace democracy in the way we did is also to accept a particular way of managing the economy in order to achieve development. For us, it is an article of faith that we must develop by conciliation and consensus, not by command. Democratic process, we concede, could slow down economic growth, but it also ensures that the political institutions that we build and the policies that we pass are both strong and enduring. I believe every country must develop according to and from its own peculiar conditions and circumstances. In the case of the Philippines, democracy is a given. It is the glue to our social cohesion, and our economic modernization must proceed from it. Although the Philippines led the world in the democratic revolutions of the second half of the 1980s, We have been latecomers to the economic revolution that began in East Asia in the 50s and the 60s. What held the Philippines back was not a lack of natural endowment or human resources. It was government policy and government performance. We started out in the 60s as the Asian country most likely to succeed, next only to Japan. But in a quarter of a century, by the end of the 80s, we had become a laggard and a continent of dragons. How we have often asked ourselves, why did we wind up in this situation when we Filipinos are supposed to be among the finest workers, managers, and scholars in East Asia, including such a big number of Harvard alumni? The answer is simply that we let politics, not markets, rule over our economy. Mistaking short-sightedness and chauvinism for nationalism, we opted, beginning in the 50s and the 60s, to reserve the economy for Filipinos. We closed our economy, looking inward to our small home market instead of outward to the large global market. We set stiff restrictions on foreign investments, barring them from many industries. We stifled competition and enterprise by allowing monopolies and cartels, most of them by family dynasties, to dominate key sectors of the economy. We made political connections, not competitiveness or talent or hard work, the determinants of economic success. We followed the same wrong path that led many countries in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Africa to economic ruin, and we achieved precisely the same sad results. And while our Asian neighbors toughened and developed their industries through global competition, we wound up with perpetually infant industries. We still have to get rid of some 50-year-old infants, by the way. While our neighbors opened their doors to foreign investments and thus to new technology, we closed ours to them. To begin with, we have lived through a painful period of stabilization just to get the macroeconomy working right. And then we moved to make the market and the private sector our main weapons for re-engineering progress. In a package of reforms our country has not seen since the end of World War II, we have lowered trade barriers, dismantled monopolies, brought government spending into line with government revenues, invested in infrastructure, and opened our industries to competition and foreign investments. Our Congress of the Philippines has cooperated fully with the executive in this regard. In the last 100 days of the 9th Congress of the Philippines, which just graduated into the 10th Congress, 62 major bills were passed, principally in economic restructuring, in social reform, in education, and in government organization. 62 major bills in 100 days, or roughly one bill every 2 days or less. We would be happy to transfer that technology to any country that is willing to accept it. We'd like you to know that we already have our National Health Insurance Code. Understand that this is still being debated hotly in some countries. And just as important, we have moved to stamp out corruption and graft in government and tax evasion in the boardrooms. This shift to a market-based development strategy has been matched by our rejection of economic nationalism of the narrow kind, as traditionally defined, which was synonymous to protectionism and even isolationism. Today we define nationalism in terms of our enhanced capacity as a nation, not with defeatism, that we cannot compete with foreigners even in our own home market, but with confidence, self-confidence in facing up to world competition. Today, this new kind of nationalism leads us to expand our foreign linkages, the better to have access to global information, capital, marketing channels, and inputs of the best quality and services and goods at the lowest costs. All these reforms, I am pleased to report to you, ladies and gentlemen, were made possible through the very close collaboration of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches of government in the Philippines. And these policies have paid off. Even this early in 3 years, we are now enjoying accelerating growth. We expect GNP to grow this year, 1995, by some 6% to 6.5% in real terms, more than double that in 1993, our first year in office. We also have a very stable peso that has fluctuated within a very narrow range, responding to market forces, but maintaining its purchasing power. In fact, our exporters now complain about the strong peso. Well, that's not really the problem. The problem is the weak US dollar in the Philippines. Our exports, in fact, are rising at an impressive rate of 30% this year. We achieved it during the first 9 months of 1995. But we hope to average a more modest 25% from 93 to 98. And this year, we also expect a record inflow of foreign investments on top of the 330% growth in investments comparing 93 to 94. For your information, on the basis of our new relationship now, which is trade, not aid, economic cooperation instead of military assistance, the United States in the Philippines has become the biggest investor, the longest standing investor, and the fastest growing country investor. And these are the numbers. In 1993, the U.S. had 24% of the total of foreign investments in the Philippines. In 94, this increased to 28%. And in the first 9 months of 95, the growth of the share of U.S. investments in the Philippines has reached 42%. And this is surely the proof of our closer relations, even if this is no longer based on defense and military considerations. The inflow of outside funds has in fact been so large that it threatens our efforts to stem inflation, which is still at single-digit numbers. But this is the kind of problem that we would like to enjoy for a change. Instead of the problems of scarcity, the problems of oversupply. The turnaround that we have had and continue to have should definitely belie the argument that democratic government is a luxury to be enjoyed only by the rich or the affluent. Our experience is proving that democracy is perfectly compatible with economic progress, and that social discipline is possible in a democratic setting. Yet we would also be the last to say that our struggle for modernization has been won, or that the ways of our democracy have fully succeeded in building an enduring national consensus for development. Actually, and I will be the first one to admit this, we still have a long road to travel, and there is still so much work to do. And because of this, we will continue to send students to Harvard University. Our greatest challenge at this time is maintaining this momentum for development. And for this, there is nothing more important than the need to increase the political capacity of our government, to continue the pace of reform, to check corruption and inefficiency in public service, to institute new standards of performance and accountability in our bureaucracy, and to ensure the rule of law in our society. Choosing between democracy and authoritarianism was for us the easier part. but meeting the challenge of making democratic government effective in the process of development is the harder component of the work. And this has to do with more than just having elections or respecting constitutionalism. This really has to do with effective administration. And this has to do also with the role of the state in the development process within a democratic society. As things stand now, we have gone a long way in taking government off the back of business, in lifting its traditional micromanagement of the economy, but in the more positive action of doing what government must do, such as providing basic services, laying infrastructure, establishing accountability and efficiency in operations, and general problem solving. Our work is far from over. Our bureaucracy remains in some ways a reproach to democratic effectiveness in the modernization process. But we are now working to unleash the bureaucracy's energies by introducing reform in organization, staffing, compensation, and all the other vital aspects of government service. The rule of law has always been upheld since our people power revolution of 1986. There is nevertheless a cause for worry in the country in regard to law enforcement, which we are addressing through immediate and long-term reforms. And it is noteworthy that more and more foreign investors and the citizenry cite judicial shortcomings as cause for concern. Our democratic politics in the legislature and media often merely exploits problems instead of solving them. There is a constant rain of rhetoric on public issues, but many continue to forget that the whole point of debate is to arrive at a solution to issues or problems. Here we come face to face with the desideratum in a democratic government, which is the political effectiveness of its national institutions. Or as the political scientist Robert Jackson has described it, the effective exercise of power without force. This is a complex challenge for government in a developing country like the Philippines, because constitutional government essentially means limited government. In a developed country, this works easily enough because the degree of public consensus is strong. In a developing country, we need all the government that we can muster to mobilize society for the task of development. Here we touch upon the tensions and contradictions that some political scientists have noted between democracy and constitutionalism. State building is necessary to society, but it also represents a threat. And constitutionalism, or the rule of law, is a design to curb state authority. These tensions are particularly acute in the Philippines, where historically the state has been weak, dominated by interest groups, and prevented from acting for the common good. Historically, the Philippine state has been weaker than the oligarchies that have preyed on it, oligarchies that have used their privileged access to the bureaucracy and to the levers of political power to accumulate great fortunes and positions of dominance. Unless we can put an end to this political arbitrariness, we cannot fully organize the national economy and enter the mainstream of global commerce. But all this suggests, ladies and gentlemen, that our long-term salvation in the Philippines lies in broadening our democracy, not in curbing it. We cannot progress much further by being a mere democracy of elites. This is the basic reason why, in running for the presidency, I ran on a program of people empowerment. There were really two pillars of this program: the economic empowerment of the people and developing a culture of excellence which will lead to global competitiveness. That is why people empowerment stands so high on the agenda of the Ramos administration as a way to mobilize the country democratically for modernization, as a way to devolve power from the center to the countryside, from the national government to our local government units, as a way of giving ordinary people a stake and a role in winning the future. Our development path, in sum, has required a changed role for the public sector. It calls for a smaller state sector than its interventionist predecessor of some 20 years ago, in that we have removed the mountain of regulations and state enterprises that used to dot our national landscape. But it also calls for a stronger and more efficient public sector, in that it must effectively exercise authority, make decisions wisely, capably solve problems, and resolve conflicts. That we have not yet fully achieved, we concede. The most that can be said is that we are moving steadily towards this ideal, step by step, reform by reform. And so let me now summarize and conclude. In choosing to develop as a democracy, the Philippines has chosen a route that considerably is more complex than that followed by our vigorous Asian neighbors. We regard politics, which is the process of conciliating rival interests and differing opinions, not as an obstacle to governing, but as the necessary precondition to concerted action on public issues. At first glance, this may appear as a disadvantage to a developing country government like the Philippines, as compared to governance with little or no consultation in an authoritarian order. But in fact, I am confident that our path will provide the advantages that will endure. As we see more and more of the global economy, we find that democracy and markets really go together. As Harlan Cleveland has noted in his Birth of a New World, and I quote, "Openness is a technological imperative in the global knowledge society. The connection between market and democracy is basic. Market divides and distributes economic power as democracy does political power. Part of the connection between democracy and market is that people governed by consent want to do business across borders that are as open as possible. The other part is that a democracy's economy is necessarily and inevitably more open to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world will be more open to it," unquote. As a free and open society, the Philippines can take part more fully in the exchanges fostered by our global economy, because we fear neither the power of ideas nor the images of other cultures. Day by day, our experience tells us that political democracy, social discipline, and sustained development are not incompatible ideals. Reform is difficult, but really, that is the only way to go. We started late in adopting the reforms so necessary to unshackle the economy and to empower our people for development. Yet in just 3 years already, we are seeing that some transformation is taking place in the Philippines. Authoritarianism is a receding tide in the world, which we do not regret in passing up. Communism did not collapse in a vacuum, but indeed all over the world, authoritarian and statist systems are being dismantled by the peoples themselves, who have awakened to their political entitlements. And so as we look to the future, we have the quiet confidence and optimism that we will succeed because of the knowledge that people and markets govern our march to progress. And that success, I am certain, is something which you too, here in Harvard, in the citadel of learning and freedom, will cheer. As we say to our people and our foreign friends, stay with me as your president, stay together as a national society, and stay with us, Filipinos, for the best is soon to come. Mabuhay Philippines 2000, mabuhay Harvard 2000. Thank you very much, and good day.
Please. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some time for questions. There's a microphone here, a microphone right here, and I believe there are two microphones up there, are there?
Right there.
Yes. And if you would be brief, identify yourself, and hopefully ask a question. Sir, right here.
My name is Bruce Kennedy. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School, and I would like to know specifically about land reform. I understand that this was one of the major issues underlying the insurrection, and that during your predecessor's campaign for the presidency, her theme was land for the tillers. But after many years of inaction, when the people came to the presidential palace to protest, the troops fired on them. Now, is this still an issue in the Philippines, and what is happening in your government?
I am happy to report to you that our agrarian reform program, our comprehensive agrarian reform program, or CARP as we call it in short, is now in its final stages. When that law was passed in 1988, government was given 10 years to implement and make the program work. We are now almost finished with the distribution of public land that is subject to agrarian reform. But the important thing for us is not just the distribution of land to the landless, but that plus, and especially, maintaining and enhancing the productivity of the land and the tillers of the land. And this is what we are now focusing on. We have combined the beneficiaries of agrarian reform under land with academic institutions like the colleges and universities in the countryside, plus the necessary partnership that they must have with local government units. On top of all of this, we have organized them into agrarian reform communities, or ARCs, equitably distributed throughout the country. We started with one ARC per congressional district, 204 of them. The next year, 1994, 2 or 3 per district. And so now, 1995, we have almost 1,000 of these ARCs, which combine the land, the tiller, and the productivity that ensues from giving technical support, giving community support, and accessing easier credit to the farmers. In the next 3 years, we hope to be able to concentrate on the distribution of public land, private land, subject to the agrarian reform law. That's really the more difficult part of it, because we must make sure that those that still hold land privately, which must be distributed to the tillers of the land, are persuaded, not commanded, and are also adequately compensated for their giving up of their land. And we have therefore tried to make the economy itself a little more vigorous, so that we can nicely persuade the owners of the land, the holders of the land, to shift from plantations to industrialization. It's still going to be a touch and go kind of a situation, but the indicators are fairly positive that we shall be able to do this within the deadline established by law, which falls on the last year of my administration, 1998.
Magandang hapon po, Mr. President. Ako si Steve Groff, ang second year
Translation,
student.
good afternoon to you.
Second year student ako dito sa Kennedy School. Kung nasa Pilipinas tayo, magtatanong ako sa iyo sa Tagalog. Pero po, nasa Amerika tayo ngayon, itong mga kababayan ko, hindi nila naintindihan pag magsisilita ako sa Tagalog. Kaya ngayon kailangan magsilita ako sa English. Mr. President.
Since I can't serve as interpreter.
You mentioned earlier.
He just said, I'll speak in English.
You mentioned earlier the problem in your country of public sector employees being poached by the private sector, and I wonder if you could comment briefly on plans for civil service reform that your administration is working on.
All right, I mentioned organization, staffing, compensation, and other vital aspects, and skills and career upgrading are among those. I inherited an office of the president with some 76 attached agencies, and these are not small agencies, they're big ones. And so that was the first effort in 1992 to devolve, decentralize, and even make disappear many of these agencies. We had, for instance, a Philippine Game Fowl Commission, which took care of regulating cockfighting in the Philippines. I don't know whether you have that here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but I tell you, yeah, well, ours is legal on Sundays and holidays, but many people like to do this, just like some of you, illegally. Anyway, under our new local government code, that function had already been devolved to provinces, cities, and towns. And therefore, this commission had to be deactivated, and that's what we did. And we only have to take care of some of the residual functions and resources of that commission, which we have assigned to a similar agency. The other kind is in regard to compensation. In the Philippines, there is a limit on public employee compensation, and that is governed by the salary of the President of the Philippines. No one must have a salary higher than that of the President of the Philippines if you are a state employee. But the salary of the President of the Philippines is established by the 1987 Constitution. So can you imagine anything more rigid than that? I must confess to you that I'm not complaining. But in a survey of Asia Week, comparing heads of government around Asia Pacific, that the Philippine president had the lowest, 25,000 pesos a month, or roughly $1,000 a month. Not much. I'm not complaining. But the problem is the cabinet ministers, the bureau directors, and the heads of various agencies, senators. By the way, we have the Senate President pro tempore here, Senator Leticia Honey. Will you take a bow? She also comes from the Boston community. From a small girls' school called Wellesley. Congressman, we have two of your alumni here, and several others who are here for our official business. Cannot be more than that. And so this is a problem. However, as we privatize many of our state agencies, we are able to compensate those in the corporate sector of government a little more equitably in terms of other benefits, non-cash or non-wage benefits. We are also strengthening the bureaucracy in terms of skills upgrading and career enhancement. We have a Development Academy of the Philippines that does part of this, and we have specialized institutions like a newly established Judicial Academy for those in the judiciary as well as in investigation, prosecution, and in legislative work. etc., etc. But maybe the biggest reform so far accomplished in this regard is the devolution, decentralization, deregulation, and democratizing of local government units. Under our local government code, fully 40% of all nationally collected revenues go to local government. And so they take care of provincial roads, municipal roads, barangay roads, and other such local projects. And we're seeing, therefore, a much more widespread effort in improving not only the bureaucracy itself, but also infrastructure.
Salamat po.
I think there's one up there. Yes. Are you standing by the microphone? No. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I am Cecilia Cortez Peck. I am an independent student, MBA at New Hampshire College. I have come here on my own accord, and just to hear you talk, I have not been home for the longest time. I miss home. One important aspect or significant part of government is the Constitution. And the Constitution has been revised and implemented, as far as I can remember, twice since I was educated. How stable is this new Constitution of yours, or the current administration's Constitution, so that it cannot be changed at the whim of those people in power?
Well, my personal opinion is that it's very stable. And my official position is that it should be maintained. If there are any discussions and even idle talk about changing the 1987 Constitution, well, that's part of our freedom. That's part of our freedom of discussion. This is taking place in some quarters of the House of Representatives. And on the part of the Senate of the Philippines, there is some discussion about saving the Constitution. Although I, for one, am not threatening the Constitution in any way so that it has to be saved. I am with them in wanting to preserve our 1987 Constitution. After all, as Chief of Staff of our Armed Forces and later on Defense Secretary, I helped President Aquino put down 7 coup attempts precisely because of our desire to uphold the Constitution. And some of the armed forces split, became mutinous, precisely because they could not live with the 1987 Constitution. Anyway, there are 3 ways to change the Philippine Constitution. And this is the process that we must follow. Even if a strong man appears on the scene, not me, if that strong man appears later on, he will still have to contend with the constitutional processes of changing the Constitution itself. And these are, number 1, the people's initiative, which would require a certain percentage of the people, really the voters, to petition for a constitutional change. The second would be the organization of the legislature itself, its 2 chambers, into a constituent assembly to amend or revise the Philippine Constitution. And the third would be the same way that the 1987 Constitution was formulated, by the choosing of a constitutional commission or a constitutional assembly, which will be mandated to draft the Constitution, but which draft later on, as with all the other drafts that would come before the people must be ratified by a majority of the electorate. So it's not simple to monkey around with the Philippine Constitution now. One guy tried it, but he got thrown out. I will not mention his name anymore.
Uh,
Go ahead.
I'm João Mariano Saldanha from East Timor and a visiting scholar at Harvard Institute for International Development. I'm interested in your government dealing with negotiation with the Moro or Mindanao, with the Moros in the Mindanao, and the government of Indonesia has been trying to be a mediator. Conversation is going on in Jakarta lately, and probably will take longer time in the near future. What I want to ask your opinion is that what you have done, I mean, both governments agreed to do it, is, I understand, is within ASEAN spirit. Is there any other way around that can also the government of Philippines try to help or try to find out ways that the East Timor problem can be be very more honorable solution for the East Timor solution? That's my
Okay, we are now into a peace process with 3 groups, all of which fought the government in a very bloody armed struggle. The other option for each of these groups to promote their causes and help their communities and followers would be what we call the legal or parliamentary struggle. In the case of the military rebels, as I said in my speech, we have come to an agreement for an honorable and enduring peace. And this has now to be discussed and later on hopefully ratified by Congress of the Philippines, because there is an amnesty action involved. The other one is, again, as I reported, in regard to the Communist Party of the Philippines and its military arm, the New People's Army. This probably was the longest standing insurgency that we have been experiencing. But I think you know that the props that support any communist insurgency have been knocked off with the collapse of the USSR and the modified market socialist approach by China and the repudiation of support for local communist insurgencies. On the part of the Philippines, we repealed the anti-subversion law, which made the Communist Party of the Philippines illegal. It's now legal. The members thereof are invited to take part in our parliamentary struggle. In other words, run for elections, run for political office. Now, in the case of the Moro National Liberation Front, the role of Indonesia arises from its being the chair of the Six-Nation Executive Committee of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference, consisting of some 50 Muslim or Islamic countries around the world. We are happy and very grateful for this important lead role that Indonesia is playing. Without Indonesia, which has already hosted and provided venues for the first 2 rounds of formal talks, I doubt very much whether we could have reached this stage already, where we can honestly report that 90% of the issues listed by both sides have been resolved by our negotiating panels. We have in the Philippines right now an autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao, the ARMM, created under the law in the 8th Congress of the Philippines. But it appears that this will be the main bone of contention still, which is the nature of the autonomy and the extent of the territory within the autonomy. It is recognized by both sides, and this could be the redeeming factor which will lead to a final political solution of this problem, that the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of the Republic of the Philippines under the Constitution must be upheld. The next round, by the way, will take place before the end of the year, so we're moving in that direction, and the signs are still good that the ceasefire entered into with the MNLF at the middle of the Corazon Aquino administration on a local basis and converted by us in the Ramos administration to a national ceasefire continues to hold. So it's better to talk instead of fight.
All right.
Okay.
Magandang gabi, President Ramos. My name is Malit Tobias, and I am a second-year student in the Masters in Public Policy and Urban Planning program here at the Kennedy School, and my family is from the province of Bulacan. My question deals with the issue of the millions of Philippine overseas contract workers. The case of Flor Contemplacion and more recently in the United Arab Emirates, those two cases hit very close to home for me, not only as a fellow Filipina, but also because I too have family that are working abroad in countries such as Japan and Greece and Saudi Arabia. My question is, what can the Philippine government do to ensure the safety and justice to these Philippine workers?
All right, this is really a very complicated question, and only the dramatic cases are being brought to the fore for public awareness or discussion. Those that are overseas number perhaps 4 million, or roughly 5 to 7% of our population. The half of that are here in the United States, but not really as just contract workers or migrant workers. We count the American citizens of Filipino ancestry, those that hold green cards or who are naturalized or who are second or third generation Americans from Filipino parentage, who are working among that number. But there are some 2 million in other countries, 130 other countries, 600,000 or more in Saudi Arabia, and maybe 1 million all in all in the countries of the Middle East, so many in Europe, so many in Asia Pacific, including in ASEAN. Those that are in trouble, like Sara Balabagan, some others, and the late Flor Contemplacion, number about 3,000. And that is 1/10 of 1% of the 4 million. In other words, 99.99% of our workers abroad are probably doing well, happy in their place of work, on good terms with their employers, and sending their earnings and savings back home. We get, on a yearly basis, some $3 billion from our overseas workers. Well, in the beginning, the policy towards them was just protection, to make sure that they were treated fairly under the laws of the host country. We now are trying to do even better than that in this administration. And this comes out of a newly enacted Magna Carta for overseas workers and Filipino nationals abroad, enacted by the 9th Congress. Aside from legal protection, also community support, meaning the other Filipinos organized into associations are mandated to provide moral and material support. What we call repatriation, if they have to be brought back home because they are really in trouble and their employers and the host country are letting them go, then the Philippine government undertakes the expenses for that process. We have the reintegration program, which is probably the most important development, meaning that back there where they are, in the place of work, they are already told about what are the opportunities in the Philippines, what does it take to be a successful small and medium entrepreneur, how do you get the most out of your savings by doing this through the banking system, what are the rates of return that you can expect, etc., etc. This also has to do with investments in housing, in a membership in an expanded social security system, which we now have. And so we are confronting both sides of the problem, the problems of those that are doing well in their places of work, as well as those that are in trouble. For those that are in trouble, we have adopted new measures, such as a deployment of our labor attachés and foreign service personnel to the countries where we have the most number of Filipino workers. We have had to open bigger foreign missions or expand existing foreign missions in the countries where we have many of our countrymen and countrywomen. That's one reason why we had to close 3 consulates general here in the United States, so that we could deploy career and experienced people to places like Japan, Saudi Arabia, etc., where the need is much more. And we have trained and retrained our people in the Sharia law, which is what predominates, what is in effect in the Islamic countries where we have this kind of problem mostly. Anyway, the real solution to this whole thing is to generate more and more jobs in the Philippines. The jobs that we call quality jobs, created by more domestic and foreign investment, where there is a collective bargaining agreement in effect, or where the worker concerned belongs to a trade union and is covered by a social security system membership. So we are moving on in that area as effectively as we can. Now, on the international side, we have asked our partners in APEC to respect the human resources that other countries make available to their respective economies. And the Philippines probably is the biggest contributor to this effort. Without the Philippines having those workers from our country out there in other countries, maybe those host countries would not be developing so progressively. We are also pushing for the ratification of the UN Convention for the protection of migrant workers and their families. This is an issue that we addressed very, very forcefully at the recent Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Cartagena, Colombia. The Philippines now is the chair of the group of 77 in the United Nations. This is really 135 countries that are considered still developing countries. And because of this General Assembly Convention to protect migrant workers and their families, the Philippines now is championing the ratification of that very important agreement. Thank you.
President, I think this will have to be the last question.
Good afternoon, President Ramos. My name is Jennifer Lacano, and I am a junior here at Harvard College, and my father hails from San Juan, Southern Leyte in the Philippines. I would first like to thank you and members of your administration, particularly Secretary Siazon, for your support of the Lakbay Aral Language Culture Study Program for the children of Filipino immigrants. As a recent participant in this program, I can assure you it's a worthwhile program, and it has had an enormous impact on my life and my future plans. My question for today, though, relates to the indigenous group, the Aetas, who are in one of the resettlement villages, or several of the resettlement villages from the Mount Pinatubo eruption. And I just wanted to know what your administration is doing to protect the culture of these people as well as their rights as an indigenous culture of the Philippines?
Thank you. I think you will find that the Philippines is among the foremost advocates of the preservation of indigenous people's culture. The Philippines is the first country to form a national council for sustainable development. And this includes the protection of the culture of our indigenous people. We don't call them cultural minorities or ethnic minorities anymore. We call them our indigenous peoples. The chairman of this body, by the way, is right here, Harvard alumni, Secretary of Economic Planning, Doctor of Economics, Shirito Habito, also a UP professor. We in the Philippines also hosted just a year and a half ago the first summit of the indigenous peoples themselves. And the Congress of the Philippines made their premises available for this very important meeting. And only last June, we hosted the World NGO Summit for Peace and Environmental Security, again included the interests of the indigenous peoples. And this was not a so-so kind of a summit, because the Secretary General or the Under Secretary General of the United Nations that presided at the Rio Summit in 1992 himself was the convening authority for this NGO World Summit for Environmental Security and Peace, referring to Dr. Maurice Strong of Canada. Anyway, because of our diverse population and diverse culture, we are very strong in the protection of our indigenous people's interests and preservation of their culture. Okay, thank you very much,
President,
Doctor.
with all of these Harvard alumni in your administration here today, I'm tempted to turn this into a fundraising event, but I won't. But people come to Harvard because they're eager to learn, and I can see why you attract so many of them, because you're clearly a wonderful teacher. You're welcome here anytime. Thank you for being with us.
Это первый.
Подруга, давай-ка грустить не будем. Вина мы нальем в бокалы и выпьем за нас с тобой. Пусть прожито лет немало и пройдено бед немало, но живо, как прежде, сердце, а значит, жива любовь. Подруга моя, подруга, ты только не плачь, не надо. Еще не такие подруга моя, подруга, ночной телефонный ангел. Меня ты не раз спасала от самой ужасной тьмы. И споры у нас забывали, и ссоры у нас бывали, но только не предавали с тобою друг друга мы. Подруга моя, подруга, ты только не плачь, не надо. Еще не такие вьюги студили с тобою нас. Подруга моя, подруга, я буду с тобою рядом и в дни золотые счастья, и в самый тяжелый час. Подруга моя, подруга, ты стала еще красивей. Вот чуточку бы счастливей, тебе это так идет. У старой своей иконы молюсь за тебя тихонько. Прошу я любви и счастья тебе на 100 лет вперед. Подруга моя, подруга, ты только не плачь, не надо. Еще не такие вьюги студили с тобою нас. Подруга моя, подруга, я буду с тобою рядом и в дни золотые счастья, и в самый тяжелый час. Подруга моя, подруга, ты только не плачь, не надо. Еще не такие вьюги студили с тобою нас. Подруга моя, подруга, я буду с тобою рядом и в дни золотые счастья, и в самый тяжелый час.
Что это? Это новый видеоплеер Panasonic. Быстродействующий механизм на цельнолитом алюминиевом шасси, который обеспечивает долгий срок службы. Мультисистемный видеотеатр P05 REU уже в России.
Panasonic.
Программа представлена. Амстел. Официальным спонсором Лиги чемпионов УЕФА.
Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья! Общественное российское телевидение начинает репортаж из английского города Блэкберн со стадиона Ивуд Парк, где через несколько минут начнется первый матч Лиги чемпионов сезона 95-96 годов. Матч в группе «Б» между чемпионом России московским «Спартаком» и чемпионом Англии командой «Блэкберн Роверс». Вот увидите составы команд. Представляю вам команду гостей. Первый номер вратарь Тим Флауэр, второй Хеннинг Берг, третий Грэм Лесо, четвертый Тим Шервуд, пятый Колин Хендри, шестой Иэн Пирс, седьмой Стюарт Рипли, восьмой Дэвид Бетти, девятый Алан Ширер, десятый Майк Ньюэлл, одиннадцатый Марк Аткинс, капитан Тим Шервуд, тренер команды Рэй Харфорд. И состав московских спартаковцев. Вот такую команду выводит сегодня на поле ее главный тренер Олег Романцев. Вратарь первый номер Станислав Черчесов, второй Дмитрий Хлестов, третий Юрий Никифоров, четвертый Илья Цымбаларь, пятый Рамис Мамедов, шестой Сергей Юран, седьмой Виктор Анопко, восьмой Василий Кульков, девятый Валерий Шмаров, десятый Андрей Пятницкий и одиннадцатый Андрей Тихонов. Капитан команды Виктор Анопко. Ну и пока есть несколько минут до начала матча, вернее, до торжественной церемонии, которая, как обычно, предшествует началу матча в Лиге чемпионов. Посмотрите нашу рекламу.
Время, по которому живет вся Россия, это время преобразований. Владение федеральной собственностью, заводами и предприятиями доступно россиянам через систему специализированных денежных аукционов. В сентябре-октябре каждый может приобрести акции российских предприятий, лидирующих в различных областях экономики. Среди них Усть-Илимский ЛПК, Ювелирпром, Московское речное пароходство, Мегион нефтегаз геология. Звоните, эта собственность может принадлежать вам.
Хотите быть сильным? Тогда Кетлер — это то, что вам нужно. Кетлер развивает силу и выносливость. Теперь вам все по плечу. Кетлер. Движение — жизнь.
Итак, общественное российское телевидение ведет трансляцию из английского города Блэкберн. Лига чемпионов, группа «Б». Здесь встречается московский «Спартак», чемпион России, и команда «Блэкберн Роверс», чемпион Англии. Вы видите капитана нашей команды Виктора Анопко. Он сейчас выведет на поле московский «Спартак» в составе: Станислав Черчесов, первый номер, второй Дмитрий Хлестов, третий Юрий Никифоров, четвертый Илья Цымбаларь, пятый Рамис Мамедов, шестой Сергей Юран, седьмой сам Виктор Анопко, восьмой Василий Кульков, девятый Валерий Шмаров, десятый Андрей Пятницкий и одиннадцатый Андрей Тихонов. Это команда Олега Романцева. Олег Романцев заявил и 5 запасных игроков. 16 номер вратарь Дмитрий Тяпушкин. И по порядку 12-й Андрей Афанасьев, 13-й Дмитрий Оленичев, 14-й Валерий Кеченов и 15-й Сергей Родионов. Что касается футболистов «Спартака», остается только добавить, что незаявленными остались 3 футболиста. Я имею в виду тех футболистов, которые также прилетели сюда, в Англию. Итак, незаявленными сегодня будут выступать в качестве зрителей Мухаммадиев, Титов и Иванов. Всего спартаковская футбольная делегация, я имею в виду игроков, состоит из 19 человек. Но, во-первых, футболисты взяли в поездку своих жен. Есть большая группа поддержки в составе примерно 300 человек. Команды выходят на поле. Состав Блэкберна: вратарь Тим Флауэр, второй Кеннинг Берг, третий Грэм Лесо, четвертый Тим Шервуд, пятый Колин Хендри, шестой Иэн Пирс, седьмой Стюарт Рипли, восьмой Дэвид Бетти, девятый Алан Ширер, десятый Майк Ньюэлл, одиннадцатый Марк Аткинс, тренер Рэй Харфорд. И арбитры сегодняшней встречи все они бельгийцы. Главный судья Мишель Пиро. Ему помогают Проспер Ван Брук и Мишель Гутелс. Повторяю, все бельгийцы и гимн Лиги чемпионов. Итак, вы видите примерную расстановку, схему игры команды Blackburn Rovers, которую для краткости будем называть просто Blackburn. И вот еще раз состав московских спартаковцев. Говорил о том, что спартаковцы прилетели сюда с женами и в сопровождении группы поддержки, но вся эта большая делегация была вместе только до города Манчестер, где приземлился чартерный рейс Ту-154. В Манчестере состоялось расставание, поскольку и жены, и группа поддержки остались в Манчестере, а команда уехала в город Болтон. Где-то минут 20 езды от Манчестера. Поселилась в гостинице в Болтоне и уже из Болтона вот приехала сюда на игру в город Блэкберн. Это еще минут 30 на автобусе. 30-тысячный стадион Ивуд Парк, а вернее, чтобы быть точным, этот стадион вмещает 31 тысячу зрителей, заполнен до отказа или заполняется. Сейчас и будет заполнен до отказа, потому что, по моим данным, все билеты на сегодняшний матч проданы. Это бельгийский судья Мишель Перро. Ему 40 лет. Я сказал уже о запасных московского «Спартака». В запасе у Блэкберна голкипер Бобби Мимс, это 13-й номер, а также 12-й номер Крис Саттон, 14-й Ли Мейкел, 15-й Мэтти Холмс и 16-й Ники Маркер. Что касается отсутствия в составе 12-го номера Криса Саттона, это небольшой сюрприз, потому что весь прошлый сезон, когда команда Блэкберн стала чемпионом Англии, именно Крис Саттон составлял великолепный дуэт с Аланом Ширером. Они забили подавляющее большинство голов в составе Блэкберна и, как я уже сказал, составляли великолепный дуэт. Саттон оттягивал на себя защитников, великолепно играл головой, ну а Ширер забивал мячи. И забил их ни много ни мало, 34 мяча в первенстве Англии прошлого сезона, стал лучшим бомбардиром английского чемпионата. Но вот в последнее время тренер Блэкберна Рэй Харфорд разочаровался в Саттоне, и сегодня в паре с Аланом Ширером на поле вышел другой нападающий, 10-й номер Майк Ньюэлл. Тем временем игра началась, и вот уже Рипли, 7-й номер Блэкберна, вступает в игру, но наши перехватывают мяч. Пятницкий его хватает за руку и за плечо Тим Шервуд, капитан Блэкберна. Первый штрафной удар Хлестов, Анопка, Никифоров, Кульков получает мяч в центре поля. Но вот уже более-менее ясна расстановка нашей команды. Три защитника: Мамедов, Хлестов, Никифоров. Чуть-чуть перед Никифоровым Анопка. 4 полузащитника. Сегодня это Цимбаларь, Кульков, Пятницкий и Тихонов, видимо, будет выполнять роль игрока середины поля. И впереди два чистых нападающих — Шмаров и Юран. Но, наверное, для вас нет сюрпризов в составе московского «Спартака». Играют все футболисты, которые, собственно, которых, собственно, «Спартак» и взял, что называется, под Лигу чемпионов. Здесь Черчесов, и Кульков, и Юран. Боевой состав московского «Спартака». Первый удар по воротам. Неуверенно действует Черчесов. Алан Ширер. Вот первый коварный удар Алана Ширера. И видно, что Черчесов немного нервничает. Отпустил мяч. А вот уже Хлестов. Пятницкий. Пытался помешать ему Дэвид Бетти. Отобрали мяч англичане. Грэм Лесо, футболист сборной Англии. Итак, напоминаем, мы ведем прямую трансляцию. Общественно-российское телевидение ведет прямую трансляцию из английского города Блэкберн со стадиона Ивуд Парк. Просим нас извинить за небольшие помехи в эфире, небольшие искажения картинки. Но надеюсь, что в дальнейшем по ходу матча все будет нормально. На ваших экранах Майк Ньюэлл, 10-й номер. Как я уже сказал, неожиданное появление в составе этого 30-летнего футболиста. Собственно, раньше он и составлял дуэт вместе с Аланом Ширером, но получил травму, пропустил довольно много матчей. И тем временем его место занял вот тот самый Крис Саттон, который сегодня сидит на скамеечке запасных. Собственно, Саттон пропустил и предыдущий матч в составе Блэкберн Роверс, матч чемпионата Англии. Простите, опасное положение. Шмаров пошел в штрафную, но у него из-под ног Иан Пирс выбил мяч. Валерий Шмаров на вашем экране. А вот центральный защитник Иан Пирс, 6-й номер Блэкберна. Ему 21 год. Илья Цимбаларь подает угловой с правого фланга. И бежит Мамедов, готов принять мяч. Нет. Подача, мяч летел на Юрана, отскакивает к Пятницкому. Пятницкий пас на Хлестова. Хлестов бьет, очень опасный удар. Во-первых, Юран, будь он немножко просторопнее, мог бы подставить ногу. Ну а во-вторых, даже и без этого мяч пролетел в опасной близости от левой от вратаря Флауэрса штанги. Посмотрите. Мог так ненароком заскочить в угол ворот. Дмитрий Хлестов, 24 года, защитник московского «Спартака» и сборной России. Пас на кого? Конечно же, на Алана Ширера. Тот пытается взаимодействовать с Майком Ньюэллом. Ньюэлл играет не точно. Пятницкий, Тихонов. Шмаров возвращает Тихонову. Тихонов переводит на левый фланг. Здесь Анопка. Пас Хлестову. Хлестов устремляется в атаку. Против него Рипли. Хлестов возвращает мяч Анопка. Кульков. Кульков, перед ним Дэвид Бетти. Кульков, очень хороший пас на Тихонова. Подключается в атаку. Подача, видимо, была на Юрана, но не точно. Флауэр. Кстати, вратарь сборной Англии, 28-летний, забирает мяч и посылает его далеко вперед. Это Кеннингсберг подключается в атаку. Пас на Рипли. Рипли простреливает. Никифоров отбивает мяч. Дэвид Бетти врывался в штрафную, но мяч застрял в ногах спартаковских защитников. И уже Пятницкий. Очень быстрое начало матча. Перед игрой тренер англичан Рэй Хартфорд сказал, что его команда будет прессинговать, вынуждать защитников московского «Спартака» ошибаться, атаковать их на их половине поля. И он надеется, что именно такая тактика принесет